At least since the clash over school desegregation more than 40 years ago, Boston has been saddled with the reputation of being unfriendly to blacks. Many things have changed over the years, but in image and substance, Boston has a long way to go. That was the picture laid out with considerable detail and nuance in the recent series by the Boston Globe Spotlight team. We'd like to welcome a member of the team and a regular columnist at the Globe, Adrian Walker. Thank you very much for being with us, Adrian.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I imagine one other thing that hasn't changed is that when you bring up the topic of race in Boston, you touch a lot of third rail. So what about the response to this?
I think the two most sensitive topics in Boston are sports and race, not in that order. So this, it definitely has gotten a lot of reaction. And that was part of what we were hoping for. Part of the goal of the series was to begin a conversation about race. And I think we definitely have done that.
Now, for people who have not really looked into this series yet, this is more than just about some knucklehead at Fenway Park. You looked at a lot of important categories of life in the city. Explain that.
One of the very early decisions in the course of creating the 7-part series was that we didn't want it to be driven by anecdotes. We really wanted to accumulate as much data as possible and really look at it in more depth than this is what happened to one person or this is what happened to one other person. Which is not to say that those individual episodes aren't important, but there's a broader picture here and a broader story we were hoping to tell.
Chris, one of the broader pictures that you looked into was power in the city. And this isn't always the out front elected officials, but there are some other people, some connections between people that are really significant. And talk about what's going on there.
Sure. We looked at politicians, we looked at lobbyists, we looked at corporate boards and who's on them. We looked at CEOs. There are only 2 publicly traded companies out of hundreds in Massachusetts that have black CEOs. So when you look at that, I mean, that is sort of the accumulation of the power structure. And when you look at it, it is really striking just how white it really is.
Why is it so white?
Because black people have just not been able to penetrate those networks, In this, I always think of Boston as sort of a small, big town, and it's so interwoven, and black professionals have just, I think, have been thwarted in trying to get to the top of those power pyramids.
Well, comparing Boston to other towns, I think reading the series, you can see a lot of racial gaps of one kind or another that you can find in other cities. There's racism in other cities, opportunity gaps. But what is it that's different about Boston? If you would compare Boston to other places you've experienced,
one of the things that was interesting, we delved into this a bit in the Power story, is that if you look at cities like Seattle and Denver that don't have huge black populations, they've had black mayors, they have more black members of their power structures than we have in Boston. I think that's unusual, and that was surprising to me. You would expect that a city like Atlanta or Washington, that are sort of these African-American meccas, will have much more black influence than a place like Boston. But even places that don't have big populations have not shut African Americans out of power in the way they have been in the city.
Of course, another way people get into power in Boston is they don't have to be born here, but if you go to school here, it helps, especially if you go to a competitive college. What do you see here?
Well, what we see here is that the competitive colleges here have the same black population they had basically in 1980. They're stuck at 3, 4, 5%. And what we also see is that the black students who come to college here don't stay here.
Of course, another thing is how you recruit students, and this goes for employees too, if you're looking for professionals here. How do you showcase the city? How do you recruit people? Where are we missing the boat there?
I think we're missing the boat in a lot of ways. I think, from the very beginning, we just don't do a good job of recruiting black professionals. I think if we could keep more college students, that is a tremendous source of potential talent that we're not doing a good job of keeping. This has a lot of components to it.
This is BNN News, and we're talking with Adrian Walker from the Boston Globe. Adrian, what your article also, not your article, your series told us about was some hard numbers on where people live, and if you look at who lives in Boston in the black community, you have the professionals who are doing pretty well, like other professionals, but a lot of other people in Boston are in poverty. Where are the working poor and the not so poor?
So where are they?
Yeah. I mean, are they forced out? Are they, punching out voluntarily? Or?
Increasingly, they're priced out. I mean, just look at what's happening in Roxbury. As it gets more and more expensive, it gets whiter and whiter, which is what happens everywhere. The single most eye-catching statistic is that in the series is that the the median net worth of white families is $247,000 in change. For black families, it's $8. I mean, that number explains an awful lot.
Another racial divide you covered in this series was healthcare. We have a lot of talk in the show about these great community health centers, Boston Medical Center doing a great job,
yes.
And yet if you look at the rest of the story, it looks strange.
Yeah, it's interesting just how white the population, the patient base of hospitals like Mass General and the partner system really is. Which is not to say anything bad about Boston Medical Center, but the level of segregation in healthcare in this city really is striking.
Why is that such a problem? If you can get good care from Boston Medical Center or good primary care in the neighborhood?
It's a problem because of what drives it. It's a problem because what drives it is where people feel comfortable. And one of the questions throughout the series is, why aren't African Americans comfortable throughout the city they call home? And whether you look at hospitals, whether you look at colleges, whether you look at Fenway Park, whether you go to the ICA, what you're seeing is a persistent pattern of people not feeling comfortable in this city they call home.
Well, speaking of persistent patterns, you wrote about life in the park.
Yes.
Is this getting any better or what?
Life in the park?
Yeah, Fenway Park.
In Fenway? I mean, what's better? Is it better than it was when I moved here 28 years ago and started going to Red Sox games? Slightly, but it's nowhere near where it should be.
What about the efforts to turn this around? I mean, we've seen management do things, but why is it important for fans to care about this?
It's important for fans to care about this because this is something we all own, and it's important for fans to care about this because it's part of what defines the city. When Adam Jones gets called the N-word in Fenway, playing center field for the Baltimore Orioles, and it reverberates all over the country. There's Boston. A headline from the New York Times. Of course, Boston.
Well, of course,
we all own it.
Another thing that we own here is how the city is showcased. And that can mean Fenway Park, it can mean college admissions, it could mean the showcase of economic growth in the Seaport District. Talk about that common denominator, the unforced
and it can
errors.
mean the tourist videos the city and the state use to promote the city, in which you will find zero African Americans, and in which all the places we showcase are places that are almost all white.
Well, finally, we should mention that if people want to plunge into this, it's going to be up online for a while, so how can they get their fingers
It's up online without a paywall, so you don't need a subscription to read it. There is a Facebook group discussing race in Boston, in which I encourage people to join and join the conversation. We want this conversation to continue.
Thank you very much for being with us.
My pleasure, Chris.
Adrian
Thank you.
Walker from the Boston Globe. And we'll have community response to the series in just a moment.